pirates of the Golden Age used a vast number of ship types, but studying exactly what types of ships these were and what they actually looked like can seem impossible. Whilst there is a bounty of paintings and illustrations of ships in Europe, the Caribbean selection is comparatively small, especially in the earlier centuries. This is further exacerbated by the vague definitions of the period, and just the general philosophy of 17th century shipbuilding. Nowadays, it is quite easy to define a sailboat or ship. You simply look at the rig, the amount of masts, and what kind of sails they got. This trend started in the late 18th century, and before then, it was much more complicated. During the Golden Age of Piracy and before, ship types were primarily defined by the shape and size of the hull, but also by the rig, and a variety of other factors like the purpose of the vessel, the amount of decks, if the vessel had a deck or not, or sometimes by the size of the certain structures, like the fore and after castle. This was largely rooted in the shipbuilding conventions of the period. European shipwrights were primarily organized into guilds, where the practice was usually passed on from father to son, with shipbuilding dynasties being uncommon but not unheard of. There were next to no blueprints or textbooks on the theoretics of shipbuilding, with most of the architects working by the rule of thumb. Smaller vessels, especially the undecked types, were often just constructed by regular carpenters, and some types of vessels were even built by pirates themselves, as we'll find out later on. So it was often difficult to exactly pinpoint what type a vessel belonged to. Different sailors might refer to the same ship as a different type. Some ships could count as multiple types, nor was there any hard agreement on the meaning of the term ship. There were some terms which were generally agreed upon. A galley was primarily propelled by oars, whereas sailboats and ships were primarily propelled by sails. These were visually distinct, with galleys being built to better facilitate rowing and the large number of oarsmen needed to operate, and sailboats and ships being built to better facilitate sailing on the open seas. But there was a disagreement between sailboat and ship. Some defined a ship as any sailboat with a deck, others any sailboat capable of carrying another vessel, and others as any sailboat rigged with a ship rig, the definition of which slightly evolved from the beginning of the period to the end, and then again in the far future. The ship rig always had 3 masts, with the evolution occurring in the sails they carried. In the early 17th century, it only consisted of a spritsail, foresail and foretopsail, mainsail and main topsail, and a mizzensail. As the decades went on, additional sails were added and invented as the shipwrights pleased, so there wasn't a single, set-in-stone ship rig. The ship rig, with its slight variations, was one, if not the most common rig in the 17th century. For the most part, vessels using it would simply be referred to as ships, even if they had slight hull variations or were used for different purposes. So the ship type, ship, short for ship-rigged, it could have been used so broadly as to become confusing. If it was ship-rigged, it would be referred to as a ship and usually nothing else, unless if it had some extreme characteristics to distinguish it. For example, this vessel has a ship rig, but a very unique hull, so it was recognized as a flyboat. This vessel has a ship rig, but has a lot of cannons and the shape to accommodate it, so it was recognized as a first rate. The ship rig, with its slight variations, was the most common rig found on merchant ships in the 17th century, and would, for the most part, simply be referred to as ships, with a few confusing side cases that will be discussed later on. It is in the myriad of other rigs with 1 or 2 masts that much of the confusion and disagreement appears. The Golden Age of Piracy also covered a rough 100-year period, a dynamic period, during which a lot of experimentation was done with ship design. A couple of the ship types listed later on did not appear until the middle or the end of the period, and others stopped existing or lost popularity. Changes occurred in hull design. As a rule, ships became longer and flatter. Naval ships accommodated more and more heavy firepower, and merchant vessels became smaller, though this is something which fluctuated and varied between nations. In terms of hull design, things only changed subtly for the smaller vessels, the kind which pirates would have used. But there were always exceptions. For example, looking at this painting from 1625, we can find on the right a very typical warship of the period around 1620 to 1670, with a broad beam and high castles. On the left is a much flatter ship, which, apart from the rig, the forward-raked foremast specifically, wouldn't have been out of place in the late 17th or even early 18th century. But looking at this image from the early 18th century, we find a Spanish galleon with a very high aftercastle, more reminiscent of ships from the previous century. So there were always going to be these peculiar side cases. And in other regards, shipbuilding didn't really evolve from the middle of the 16th century until the end of the 18th, because some features were simply the best they had with the technology available. For example, the length of ships largely remained the same until the early 19th century, when new technology allowed for the construction of incredibly long ships. Another development of the period was that ship types became more specialized. In the 16th and early 17th century, specialized warships were quite uncommon. Instead, governments would levy merchantmen to assist them during wartime. For this purpose, and also to defend themselves against pirates, and also to do a bit of piracy on the side, early merchantmen were large and heavily armed. But in the early to mid-17th century, the growth of organized navies led to a rise of specialized warships that could accommodate more heavy artillery than cargo vessels. This in turn led to the rise of specialized merchant vessels that carried fewer weapons and had a smaller crew, but could consequently carry more cargo. Indeed, ships were often categorized based on their purpose. In a journal, you might read of an engagement between a privateer and a trader, for example, because the purpose of the ship was often indicative of its design qualities. These categories included, but were not limited to, men-of-war, merchantmen, privateers, letter-of-marques, fishers, coasters, and pirates. In turn, these vessels often had many subcategories. The term warship wasn't really used in the period, if at all. Instead, they used man-of-war in reference to a commissioned vessel outfitted by a state navy for the purpose of war. Their purpose was to defend coastlines, engage enemy men-of-war, and capture cities. They could also be used for escort assignments and even commerce raiding. Owing to their primary purposes, they had to be strong, accommodate large crews, and carry a lot of firepower. As a consequence, they weren't as speedy as other types, but they didn't have to be for their intended purposes, and were also accompanied by smaller and more nimble scouting vessels that usually had the qualities of privateers and pirates. In the Royal Navy, men-of-war were designated into ratings based on their number of guns, going from 1 to 6, with 1 being the largest and 6 the smallest. Anything smaller than a 4th rate was deemed unfit for the line of battle, whereas unrated vessels included a variety of small, poorly armed vessels used for scouting, coastal patrols, pirate hunting, or niche battle purposes like bomb vessels, used in sieges. Rated ships always had a ship rig, whereas unrated vessels often didn't. Merchantmen were trading vessels. The most vanilla-flavored merchantman was decently sized, had a simple rig able to be handled by a small crew, fewer men meant fewer wages, and could carry a lot of cargo. But there were a lot of subcategories of merchantmen, owing to different regional conditions and even types of cargo. The most basic, all-round merchantman weighed between 100 to 300 tons, had a ship rig and a square stern. East Indiaman was specialized in traveling to Asia. It could sometimes imply a very specific type, or sometimes very different ships just adapted for the Asian trade. West Indiamen specialized in Caribbean commerce. Slave ships are perhaps the most unique, since they carried a cargo with an expiration date. They'd be susceptible to horrific diseases, leading to staggering death tolls. So the slaves had to be delivered quickly, meaning that slave ships had to be fast. Thus, they shared many qualities with scouting vessels and privateers, and it was common to convert one to either purpose, depending on what was profitable. This also meant that they were sought after by pirates. Infamous pirate ships like the Widow, Queen Anne's Revenge, and the Speaker were all former slave ships. On the open sea, slave ships could often be detected by their horrible smell. That brings us on to privateers, an abbreviation of private man-of-war. These were privately owned ships, commissioned in wartime for commerce raiding. So as aforementioned, they had to strike a middle ground between men-of-war and merchantmen. Strong enough to subdue the merchants, fast and nimble enough to catch them, and to escape the men-of-war, all the while striking an economic balance. In peacetime, privateers were also commissioned for shipwreck recovery, escort duties, and pirate hunting. To explain this, the purpose of a man-of-war was to win the war, no matter the cost. So make them as big, heavy, and shooty as possible. But the purpose of the privateer was to go after enemy commerce, or specifically, for the private investors to make money. So, sure, if you had the money to blow, you could make a super big, shooty, scary ship, but that will require a huge investment, without the guarantee of making a worthwhile profit, provided your ship isn't defeated or sunk in a storm. Now, men-of-war, including rated ships, did partake in pirate-like actions, like captures of the Spanish treasure fleet or the sacking of cities. The commanders of these fleets would profit from it immensely, and naval commanders often did run a side gig of plunder and illicit trade. Still, these incidents were far out and in between. The treasure fleet was only captured a few times over 3 centuries. Plunder and ransoming of cities was common military practice of the period. Here's the risk of having a legal or philosophical discussion on what constituted a pirate and a soldier, and now isn't the time for it. So instead of acquiring a massive, costly ship, you could just take a small and quick vessel, slap a few cannons on it, buy a couple of muskets, and wish the boys good luck. Then you haven't spent a lot of money, but could potentially earn 2, 5, 10 times the investment in profit. So in this case, the investors had to find an appropriate balance. How much do we want to risk and invest? Privateers could be anything from essentially a rowboat with a mast to a full-rigged ship of 40 cannons. This was largely based on the intended voyage of the privateer. A privateer sailing from France to the Indian Ocean was definitely going to be bigger than a Spanish coast guard hunting smugglers on the coast of Honduras. But again, compared to merchants and men-of-war, they all embodied the distinct qualities of being speedier. Now, the line between a privateer and a pirate ship is very fine, if it even exists. Most pirates consider themselves privateers for different reasons, and often refer to their ships as such. It was usually their enemies who referred to them as pirates. However, pirate ships could instantly be recognized by their lack of decorations and heavy superstructures like raised castles. These impeded the speed of the vessels, and pirates had no social qualms about removing them, unlike civilized society. Letter of marque ships were something between merchants and privateers. Whilst privateers had a privateering commission, letter of marque ships had a letter of marque, or mark. This allowed them, during wartime, to capture enemy prizes, like a privateer, if the opportunity allowed them. But in most cases, letter of marques were primarily merchants, and the capture of prizes was kind of like a side quest, even if some desperate privateers would take letters of marque in lack of anything better. But a letter of marque ship was basically a hybrid between a merchant and a privateer, having some of the qualities of both. Fishers or fishermen were, well, quite self-explanatory. These vessels were small and usually designed to catch a specific type of fish. So there was a difference between the cod fishing vessels of Newfoundland and the herring bosses of Northern Europe. But I can't really be bothered to go into the differences too much. And pirates were unlikely to keep fishing vessels, perhaps partially due to the smell. Coasters were kinda similar to fishermen. These were vessels designed purely for coastal trade. There are a couple of bonus types. Usually they belong to one of the previous types, but had been refitted to fulfill a more niche purpose. Hospital ships were vessels designated to accommodate the sickly. Sometimes if there was a great deal of wounded, or even to quarantine the diseased. These vessels were preferably heavier, so that they would move around less. I don't know about you, If I was sick with yellow fever or had my leg amputated or something, I wouldn't want to stay in a hospital that just kept rocking like a festival. Tenders were basically floating storages, supply ships accompanying another ship and carrying her spare supplies or even plunder. These were very often found in pirate fleets, so that they could carry the heavy cargo aboard a tender and use their privateers or capital ship to speedily capture new prizes. Fire ships were vessels kitted out with a bunch of combustible materials, set alight and directed upon the enemy like a pre-industrial torpedo. They could set other ships and structures on fire and even explode. A deadly weapon in the age of sail, which could either be improvised or even built from the ground up for this specific purpose. However, some of the special-built fire ships were later converted into normal ships. There were also two other measures which ships were understood by: tonnage and guns. Both of these might seem apparent at first, but are just as confusing as everything else. For one, tonnage isn't exactly a precise measure of the ship's weight. It more so determined how much cargo the ship could carry, which doesn't seem very illustrative, since we'd probably understand a ship better if we could get the weight in tons, like a truck. But in the period, you needed to know how much a ship could carry in order to impose tolls upon it. However, the measure of tonnage changed over time and differed between nations. The first medieval system was determined by wine barrels, for example. The number of guns might seem indicative of the ship's size, but this isn't always the case, because the guns themselves often varied in size. This can best be observed in the large superships of the 16th century, like the Mary Rose. She had as many as 91 guns, but only between 10 to 20 of these were carriage guns that we'd understand as cannons, with the rest being swivel guns or large handheld pieces. This wasn't as extreme in the 17th century. If you'd see a 20-gun frigate, it most likely had somewhere around 20 cannons. But on occasion, these numbers did at least include swivel guns, which aren't that heavy and don't take up a lot of space. And the cannons of a small sloop and a large man-of-war were obviously different. In general, the cannons found aboard a pirate or merchant ship were different from men-of-war. Again, merchants and privateers were kinda stingy, so they tried to buy the most effective cannons for the smallest price possible. Sometimes they might even use wooden decoy cannons called quakers, but usually they settled for smaller cannons, mostly because they were cheaper. However, they could only really do damage to enemy crew and rigging, but for pirates, that sufficed. Men-of-war, on the other hand, had money to blow and ships to blow, so they could buy the biggest and best. Lengthy introduction aside, I think we can now get into the particular ship types of the period. See how they evolved, which one pirates and their enemies would have used, and why. The mighty Galleon is a good starting point, not because pirates ever actually used it, but because the history of this legendary vessel is very illustrative of the evolution of ship design, purpose, and the confusion of changing terminology. A galleon in the early 16th century was not the same as a galleon a few decades later, and certainly not the same as a galleon in the early 18th century. All of these clash with our very romantic notion of what constitutes a galleon. The earliest galleons were Venetian craft, combining oars and sails, and the term was later adapted by the Portuguese in reference to small patrol vessels in the Indian Ocean. By the 1530s, galleon had come to mean a small to medium-sized vessel, smaller than the massive carracks. They could still carry oars and escorted the larger carracks as they carried treasure from the New World. Compared to the carrack, the basic design of the galleon was speedier and more seaworthy. So as the 16th century progressed, the carrack faded out of usage, whereas the galleon became bigger and replaced it. By the mid-16th century, the Spanish galleon had grown into a large to mid-sized vessel, less likely to carry oars, and assumed its distinct silhouette of a high aftercastle but a low forecastle. The Spanish viewed naval combat as an extension of those on land. Big ships could carry more men for boarding combat, and the castles were advantageous high grounds for archers and gunmen. Larger galleons would come to replace the carracks as the cargo ships of the treasure fleet, and they would fulfill any assignment from commerce to military. They were a hybrid vessel. You see, national navies did not really exist in 1500s, with most wartime vessels being merchantmen levied into service. Most ships, galleons included, were constructed by merchant conglomerates for trade and privateering, the line between which was vague in the period. So galleons had to be able to sail fast, carry men and cargo, fight, and escort. The design also differed between nations. The English saw the merit in longer galleons with lower castles, focused on speed and heavy firepower. Cannons instead of the Spanish fixation on boarding combat. These galleons, often called race-built or razzies, were the type used by sea dogs like Hawkins and Francis Drake. Their initial design had been based on the galleasses of Henry VIII. As the 16th century grew into the 17th, artillery production became better, and naval tactics became increasingly centered on long-distance broadsides rather than boarding action. Thus, there was less of a need for the galleon's high aftercastle. Even in these tactics, a high aftercastle provided a good lookout platform for the officers and a vantage point for musketeers. But it also slowed the ship down and took up space. Organized state navies were also coming into being in England, France, and the Netherlands. This gave rise to increasingly specialized vessels, instead of the hybrid war and merchant ships, levied into service during the 16th. So the galleon, the archetypal hybrid vessel, became ever more obsolete, both for merchants and men-of-war. But the evolution didn't occur overnight. England seems to have retained some of its old galleons into the 1610s, maybe 1620s, and even though the word galleons stops appearing in reference to English ships during this period, there were still many other types of ships which had galleon-like characteristics. Full-rigged, long beaks, high aftercastles. So it is easy for anyone to look at a 17th century ship painting and say, that's a galleon. Like I said in the beginning, our understanding of a galleon today is completely different from back then, when it was more niche and also evolved. Now, both the English and Spanish had a conservative streak and would cling to the archaic galleon design, the English into the 1630s and the Spanish well into the middle of the century. By then, the Spanish had signed a peace treaty with the Dutch, allowing this long-standing enemy to become an important trade partner instead. The Dutch supplied them with slaves, but more importantly, with ships. Unlike the old galleons, these Dutch-built ships were specialized privateers, men-of-war, and merchantmen. By the mid to late 17th century, galleon referred only to treasure ships, ferrying their valuable cargo from Manila to Mexico, and Mexico to Spain. As late as the 18th century, many of them would retain their old profile, but most of them would increasingly be constructed in a more regular fashion. So in most 18th century depictions of galleons, they look like any large merchant vessel of the period. The 17th century galleon was not a pirate ship. As aforementioned, pirate ships had to be fast, and the galleon didn't fit the bill. Nor would pirates even be able to capture one. They were massive and sailed in large convoys. These treasure fleets were captured on 2 occasions in the 17th and early 18th centuries, but by organized state navies, not the pirates we're familiar with. Instead, our pirates usually went for the Manila galleon, which was typically smaller and sailed in fewer numbers. Woodes Rogers, a privateer, did successfully capture a smaller one in 1709, but was beaten back by a larger. The Manila galleon was notoriously elusive, however, owing to the sheer size of the Pacific. But, as aforementioned, in the early 1600s especially, there were smaller ships and ship types with galleon characteristics. As late as 1709, Rogers mentioned a 400 or 500-ton ship constructed galleon style. But if a pirate ever got his hands on one of these ships, they would have cut down the iconic aftercastle to make it speedier. The galleon was not a pirate ship. One of those vessels with galleon characteristics is perhaps the equally confusing pinnace. This word is so confusing because it could refer to vastly different vessels, anything from a tiny rowboat to a full-rigged merchantman. To add further confusion, any of these vessels might have gone by a variety of other names. Now, what seems to have distinguished the pinnace from other ships was that she wasn't built from heavy oak, but a much lighter pine, hence the name, borrowed from the French pinasse, derived from the Latin pinus. Indeed, the lighter weight would have made the pinnace more suited for scouting, packet deliveries, privateering, and slave trading. And though it doesn't seem as if all or even most pinnaces were built from pine, the pinnace was certainly used for those purposes in the 17th century. They were especially popular in Scandinavia, the Netherlands, the Bay of Biscay, France, and in England and its colonies in the early to mid 17th century. Even though the pinnaces differed in size and rig, their shape seems to largely have been the same. They were thinner than most other vessels and longer. This would have leaned into their swift properties, and it was well suited for rowing. However, it is difficult to distinguish the smaller pinnaces from other tiny vessels. It is only the full-rig pinnaces that are truly distinct from other types of ships, and many recognize this type as the only true pinnace. Again, the full-rig pinnace was longer and thinner than its contemporaries. However, it still had some galleon-esque properties, like a distinctively raised aftercastle, and sometimes a long beak. As the 17th century developed, the full-rig pinnace grew in size, from 70 feet 21 meters to 134 feet 40 meters. It had now become popular as a medium-sized merchantman in France and the Netherlands, combining the qualities of a merchant and man-of-war. Kalmar Nyckel, a pinnace instrumental in establishing the colony of New Sweden, was recently built as a replica and stored in the Copeland Maritime Museum. The pinnace was popular in New England, as a French merchantman, and as a Dutch privateer. It doesn't seem to have been an especially common pirate ship. However, the small pinnaces certainly were. Pinnaces were used as ship's boats by Pacific privateers, like William Fennell and Woodes Rogers. These were equipped with at least a single mast, and possibly even a cannon or swivel gun. They were used for fishing, scouting, landing troops, and catching targets faster than the flagships. By the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, high castles faded out of usage, and the name of pinnace stopped appearing in Dutch records. Instead of using pinnaces as its escorts and commerce raiders, the Dutch had adopted the frigate. More so than the previous types, a frigate has a long, complicated, and convoluted history of confusion and evolution. The word is still used today in reference to a variety of warships, but, much like in the period, the usage is inconsistent. However, the frigate has always been consistent in one regard. It has always been faster than other warships. The first frigates appeared in the Mediterranean, but the sources disagree on what kind of vessel it referred to exactly. Most seem to agree that it was some sort of oar-powered sailboat. By the 1590s, the Flemish privateers of Dunkirk had come to use a variety of designs collectively called frigates, ranging in size from small open boats to large vessels of 200 or 300 tons. The exact architecture of these frigates remains unknown, apart from the fact that they were fast, had a low profile, and made great use of oars. However, they also had a short lifespan of around 5 years, whereas regular ships could last 20 or more. The English were slow at adopting the frigate, sticking instead to the similar pinnace until the 1640s, when a number of frigates were constructed according to the Flemish model. These did not feature oars and were more heavily armed, and seemed to have been used as battleships instead of cruisers. In the subsequent decades, they became heavier and carried more guns. However, small frigates of 300 tons and way less seems to have been privately constructed and used in the New World. Henry Morgan captained the 22-gun, 120-ton Satisfaction, classified as a frigate. Morgan's fleet contained 3 other frigates, with an average weight of 50 tons, and armament of 10 guns. These smaller frigates seem to be in line with the French design, which offers a clear history of evolution. The French frigates began as the double shallop, a large, undecked vessel, armed with swivels and propelled by oars. By increasing the length and adding a deck, the barquelon was created, By increasing the dimensions, adding more guns, and aftercastle and small forecastle, the frigate had been born. By 1670, frigates had appeared in the French Navy. A distinction was made between ship frigates and light frigates. Basically, the former were larger and ship-rigged. The latter were smaller and presumably ship-rigged for the most part. There was a grey area between light frigates and other small vessels. And by 1690, the French Navy said that anything more than 14 guns and less than 20 was a light frigate. So by 1670, the type of frigate popular with pirates and privateers had been born. Though it could vary immensely in size from 50 to 4 or even 500 tons, their design stood out from other contemporary types. Longer than merchantmen, smaller than rated ships, lower superstructures than pinnaces. They were sleek and speedy, with good firepower and excellent for rowing. The frigate was very much the perfect pirate ship. I mentioned briefly the barque longue and shallop, which means that it's time to talk about those types next, starting out with the barque or bark. Possibly the weirdest, but also most straightforward ship type of the period. It was basically the basic sailboat, and if someone was uncertain on what to call a sailboat, they would probably call it a bark. This both makes it easy and difficult to define the bark. If the hull is particularly distinct, like it's very long, very round, has high superstructures, then it's probably a specific type. But if it doesn't and is just a basic shell, it might in all likelihood be a bark. So a bark could be a small ship, a boxy, apple-bowed, square or round-sterned vessel with a standard ship rig and usually no superstructures. Others defined barks as ships that had masts with cross trees instead of tops connecting the masts. Tops are large, square platforms. But it could also be a large boat, often double-ended, with a simple rig, usually a one- or two-masted square rig. All of these vessels were cheap and easy to produce, and seemed to be the basic workhorse of the colonies, used in everything from coastal transport, fishing, trading, pirate hunting, and piracy. They could be fitted with oars and rowed quite decently. The simplicity of the bark allowed pirates to construct them themselves. When privateer Captain George Shelvach was shipwrecked on Juan Fernandez, he and his men used salvaged wreckage to construct a 20-ton bark. She had a small deck and could carry enough cannons for Shelvach to continue his privateering voyage. The simplicity of a bark also allowed it to be constructed from a kit called barque en fagon, meaning bark in bundles. It contained all the parts needed to construct the bark, packed into another vessel, and transported to a new place for assembly. The barque longue was a special type of bark that was longer, thinner, and did not have a deck. It carried two masts and, as aforementioned, would eventually develop into a new deck type that would also be called a light frigate, but also a corvette. The distinction between barque longue, corvette, and light frigate is one of those confusing grey zones in the late 17th century. So yeah, the bark was one of the most confusing ship types of the 17th century. By the 19th century, with its streamlined definition of ship types by rigs, the bark sail plan referred to three masts, the fore and main square-rigged, and the mizzen without a square rig. The bark was not the only ship type that could be constructed from a kit. There was also the chaloupe en fagon, shallop in bundles, bringing us on to another one of the very basic but very important ship types of the period. The shallop was by the beginning of the 17th century an old, trial and tested design that had been used in all of Europe for trading, whaling, and as a ship's boat for larger vessels. Generally, it was an undecked, strongly built, double-ended workboat, propelled both by oars and sails. They were perfect in the early colonies as the simple design made them cheap and easy to produce. It also allowed them to be modified, add cabins or fortified structures for defense, or cut the shallop apart and make it bigger. And perhaps most importantly, they served as a stepping stone in the evolution of later ship types. Most importantly, the sloop, whose name derives from the shallop. However, the shallop would be used well into the 18th century. The sloop would become the quintessential pirate ship, But before we can talk about it, we have to talk about one of its most important progenitors, the yacht. Nowadays we recognize the yacht as a pleasure craft. This usage of the term first appeared in the 17th century, when the Dutch gifted a yacht to Charles II to be used as a pleasure craft. Originally, the Dutch had used them for escort duties, scouting, and privateering. The name comes from the Dutch word for hunting or chasing. The Dutch yacht came into being in the late 16th or early 17th centuries, and the first ones were simply miniature East Indiamen, being 60 to 80 feet long and weighing between 25 to 40 tons. The rigs varied immensely, with some having ship rigs, and others having one or two masts with a variety of sails. They seem to have been heavily experimented upon. Speedy, maneuverable, and carrying a decent armament, they served as the eyes and ears of the East India fleet. They were also quite common in the American colonies, at least before the last decades of the 17th century. In terms of hull design, they were similar to pinnaces, but usually had a lower profile, sometimes as low as to be indistinguishable from the latest sloop. The sloop was the ship type most used by the pirates of the Golden Age. This is kinda perfect, because the sloop is one of the most ambiguous and mysterious ship types of the 17th century. The problem is that we have a very narrow definition of what defines a sloop. A long and sleek hull, a single mast, and a specific rig. In the colonies, this design seemed to have been sort of standardized at some point in the early 18th century, or at least been popular. But it was preceded by intense experimentation in the 17th century, when the sloop lacked a precise definition, and referred instead to a variety of decked sailboats, all with a similar design and purpose, but very different rigs. In some regard, this seemed to have been the case until the 1730s. According to A Naval Expositor, written in 1732 by Thomas Riley Blankley, sloops are sailed and masted as men's fancies lead them, sometimes with one mast, with two, and with three, with bermudos, shoulder of mutton, square lug, and smack sails. They are in figure either square or round-sterned. Sloops first appeared in the English language in the 1620s, describing a variety of small trade and privateering vessels used by the Flemish and Dutch. In the mid-17th century, the English began to use the term themselves to describe vessels of a similar size and purpose, even though they differed immensely in the rigs. Indeed, sloops were sometimes indistinguishable from other vessels like barks, yachts, or ketches, and the Navy seemingly just adapted the word sloop to bunch all of these similar vessels into one comprehensive category. Small ships used for operations that required a fast, light, and nimble vessel. Around the same time, sloops appeared in the English colonies, likely as an evolution of the shallop, yacht, and the Dutch sloop. It soon became the most popular type across the colonies, with the French calling them barque or brillantine, and the Spanish balandra. Places like Jamaica, Rhode Island, and Bermuda would all develop their own distinct type. The Jamaica sloop seems to have appeared in the first decades of English settlement, built from red cedar, native to the island. 3 of them appeared in the fleet of Henry Morgan. 2 of them weighed 12 tons and carried no guns. The last one weighed 30 tons and had 4 guns. We know nothing about their rigs. Sloops would become quintessential to the commerce of Jamaica, and their sailors would become known as sloopmen, whether they were fishermen, smugglers, or pirates. Governor Lynch said in 1682 how there were 20 sloops on Jamaica, weighing between 15 to 45 tons, and carrying 6 to 8 guns, and crews of 20 to 30 men. Even better than the Jamaica sloop was the Bermuda sloop. It isn't certain what it looked like in the 17th century, but by the 80s and 90s, it was desired from Spain to Newfoundland for its speedy qualities, by merchants and pirates alike. Bermuda sloops were used by scalawags like Thomas Tew and Charles Vane. The design was continuously refined until the first decades of the 18th century, when we finally receive a ship plan in 1740. What distinguished the Bermuda sloop the most was its deeply raked mast, an iconic feature of the earliest Bermuda boats. The many different ship designs of the 17th century would coalesce into a uniform sloop design that would remain uniform in the colonies for the rest of the 18th century. Sleek lines, a single mast with a square sail, sometimes a topsail, a triangular headsail, and a boom with a large gaff sail. This is the sloop as we know it. We can take a quick breather from the complicated ship types by looking at one which was always very clear-cut: the ketch. In the 17th century, it's unanimously referred to a specific type of hull with a narrow range of sail plans. Ketches were small, ranging in size from 10 to 70 tons, with the smaller ones dominating. The single deck was continuous from stem to stern, most of them lacking a cabin, and the hull was double-ended, meaning that the stern was dramatically slimmer than the bow. Double-ended vessels were more maneuverable and seemed to have been easier to build, but there are some disagreements on the exact qualities. In terms of rig, most ketches lacked a foremast, having only a main, mizzen, and bowsprit. These were rigged in a variety of fashions: lateen sails, gaff sails, or square sails. Compared to the sloop, the sails of a ketch were smaller and required fewer hands to manage. Thus, it was well suited for fishing and trading, and became one of the most popular vessels in 17th century New England. It didn't perform well unless you had a wind at your back, meaning that it wasn't the best pirate vessel. When it did appear under pirate command, they used it for surprise attacks. Their enemies never suspected pirates to use such a sluggish vessel, and allow them to get close. In the 1720s, it would get procedurally supplanted by the schooner. The schooner as a vessel was purely defined by its sail plan: a two-masted fore and aft rig with the second mast as tall or taller than the first. Additional sails might then be added to the rig, usually square sails. It would often be constructed with a long and sleek hull, but this was not a requirement. The schooner is beautiful and distinct, but the name started only to appear in the 1710s, and by the 1720s it had replaced the ketch. As the 18th century progressed, the schooner would even begin to rival the sloop. The main advantage of the schooner was that it had smaller and lighter sails that required less manpower to handle, seemingly without any loss of speed. This also made it a popular pirate and privateer vessel of the period, and it could operate well under oars. It has been disputed when the schooner was first invented. One legend attributes it to Gloucester and the year 1713, but the rig had appeared in the previous decades. It is uncertain who invented it or when, but it seems to have been pioneered by the Dutch yachts. The rig was most definitely used on a number of yachts and sloops, without ever receiving any special recognition, until the 1710s. The piratical qualities of the brigantine can be found in the name itself, believed to derive from the word brigand, meaning a bandit. The brigantine was very much one of the popular pirate vessels of the Golden Age, but again, it is one of those complicated vessels that has seen extensive evolution. The brigantine first appeared as the brigantino or bergantin, a small sort of galley used in the Renaissance Mediterranean. They carried up to 30 oars, each rowed by a single man, and had a single mast with a lateen or square sail. The Spanish brought them to the New World, where they were used for coastal work. Hernán Cortés constructed 13 bergantines for his assault on Tenochtitlan, situated in the middle of a lake. By the 17th century, brigantines had become one of the most popular pirate vessels. Most were similar to the vessel of the previous century, though it had seemingly decreased in size. A long and slender open boat, used for fighting and chasing. It had 12 or 15 benches, one man to each bench. Every oarsman was a fighter, with his musket under his bench. The brigantine was built with 1 or 2 masts, usually square-rigged. And this definition is rather to the point, and we can't just have that. So in the late 17th century, the term brigantine began to diverge. On one hand, brigantine could refer to a 1 or 2 masted vessel with a deck, and a hull constructed in the sleek, dagger-like fashion to the undecked brigantine. On the other hand, it would refer to a rig, defined by the Oxford Dictionary as a square-rigged foremast, and a fore and aft rigged mainmast. But this was far from consistent. There were brigantines which did not have the Oxford-defined rig, and vessels which met the definitions of the brigantine, but were called corvettes or sloops. The hull was virtually indistinguishable from the sloop, and some say that they differed in the rig, but there is an image of brigantines with only one mast. Basically, the brigantine of the 17th century could refer to a small, slenderly built vessel with one but usually two masts, carrying a simple rig, and performing well under oars. In defining it, there was a lot of overlap between other similar types like the sloop, corvette, and yacht. I won't dive into the corvette, by the way. In the 17th century it was basically just a French synonym for brigantines and light frigates. In the early 18th century, the different brigantines would merge into the Oxford definition of a two-masted vessel with a square-rigged foremast and a fore and aft rigged mainmast. In the late 18th century, the abbreviated brig referred to the same rig, but with a gaff sail. The word itself had existed previously, but was only really used as an abbreviation. The same vessel could have been referred to brigantine and brig. To add further confusion to the brigantine debate, there was also the snow, which was closely related, but luckily very different. Though it had a hull very similar to the brigantine and brig, the snow had a tiny trysail mast erected just behind the mainmast, upon which was rigged a single gaff sail. This allowed the main yard, the boom holding up the square sail, to be lowered. East Indiamen were European ships that traded with Asia, primarily India, China, and the Moluccas. The Portuguese had utilized the aforementioned nau or carrack, whereas the Dutch of the late 16th century began to use actual warships. These massive vessels weighed hundreds of tons and were of little use in the shallow waters of the Netherlands, but were perfect for the long voyage eastwards. The VOC were happy to buy the old warships, and the Navy were eager to sell them. Later East Indiamen would be purpose-built cargo ships, but they would retain some of their old warship qualities, specifically the armament. The companies had the right to wage war if they wished, and in the early days often behaved like pirates. Additionally, the waters around Madagascar would be haunted by actual pirates, especially between 1680 and 1730. The many and heavy guns of East Indiamen could serve as a repellent, and from a distance, their silhouette made them indistinguishable from men of war. Aside from cargo ships, they could serve on escort duty, protecting other East Indiamen or even native traders from the pirate threat. When Captain Kidd made hostile attempts on the pilgrim fleet of the Red Sea, he was scared off by an East Indiaman called Septa, depicted here in beautiful watercolor, painted by her very commander, who hunted Kidd. Of course, East Indiamen would evolve in their design from the late 16th to the 19th century. They procedurally grew straighter, flatter, and lost their heavy, Baroque decorations. The weight and armament of East Indiamen fluctuated. In some periods they were heavier, then lighter, then heavier again. Even though they were primarily built for carrying cargo, the likes of silk and spices, the Indiamen had good sailing qualities, and were always desired by the pirates of the region. Pirate Indiamen included the 28-gun Cassandra and the 34-gun Mocha. The latter had seemingly been built as a frigate, making her speedier than the average Indiaman. Another very popular merchant ship of the 17th century was the flute or flyboat, and which, fortunately, followed a very specific definition and such an iconic design that just about anyone can recognize her. Known as the fluit in her native Dutch tongue, she was invented in the late 16th century to accommodate the shallow waters of the Netherlands. Indeed, the flyboat had a flat bottom, allowing her to enter into shallow waters. She is most recognized by the bulbous shape of her hull and the rounded stern. This allowed her to carry more cargo, but it also served a defensive purpose. It was harder for boarding parties to scale the sides of it. Similar hulls were used by a variety of other Dutch vessels, like the hooker and hackboat. Flutes were most often ship-rigged, but compared to other ships, her masts were shorter, allowing the vessel to be handled by a smaller crew. This made a flyboat very affordable, since the owners had less wages to pay. The design proved a resounding success, and the flyboat was quickly adapted in the rest of Europe. The Spanish would call it Urca, and it was their most popular merchant ship in the New World. Most prominent was the Honduras Urca, a sort of mini treasure ship, carrying the riches of eastern Mexico back to Spain. Escorted by frigates, she was a common target for pirates. The English were slower at adapting the flyboat, mostly owing to their decades-long conflict with the Dutch throughout the 17th century. Whilst they wouldn't build their own flyboats, they would instead commandeer captured Dutch ones. It wasn't until the late 1670s that they would also construct their own. However, the Flute was not a suitable pirate ship, but it was the most popular merchant ship of the century, and would have been a common target. However, a certain branch of pirates, filibusters, from the French flibustière, was named after the flyboat, or flibon. In French, flibustière was the word for the buccaneers, who dominated the 17th century Caribbean. However, the name most likely derived from the smaller version of the flyboat, also called the Pink. The following was written in a French book from the 17th century called The Customs of the Sea. Frigates, pinnaces, brigantines, pinks are privateering vessels, light and medium-sized, dovetails of the sea. Whereas the Flute usually weighed between 3 to 500 tons burthen, the Pink could be as small as 60 tons. One of these, called the Abraham's Sacrifice, was part of Henry Morgan's fleet. What distinguished the Pink from the Flute, apart from its smaller size, was the pinked stern. This meant that the stern was tight and narrow at the end. This style wasn't unique to the Pink, with the pinked stern appearing on other vessels like pinnaces. So it is possible that Pink was used as an umbrella term for any small vessel with this feature. It would have improved speed and also made them more maneuverable. A couple of notable Pinks were documented in the hands of pirates. Louis Guittard commanded the 140-ton, 28-gun Lapin, said to be an excellent sailor. Edward Lowe was captain of a Portuguese Pink, the 34-gun Rose. The flat bottom of the Pink would have been desired by pirates, as it allowed them to enter into shallow waters for pursuit, escape, and repairs. The oldest vessel found in the Caribbean was the dugout canoe. It was used by the first pirates of the Caribbean, the Caribs, namesake of the islands. Hailing from the South American coast, these cannibalistic warriors swarmed the islands in their fleets of dugout canoes, slaying the peaceful inhabitants, called Taino. For the next 100 years, the Carib would dominate the archipelago until the arrival of Christopher Columbus. He and his Spaniards hunted the Caribs with dogs, reducing their population to a minimum. The Caribs shared a hatred of the Spanish with the French and English pirates, and taught them how to use and construct a canoe. It had already become the most popular boat in the New World colonies, north to south. It was used for fishing, trading, piracy, and for delivering people between ships or ashore. They were often carried aboard of bigger ships or towed behind them. To make a canoe, a suitable tree was cut in half. It was then carved into an appropriate shape, usually sharp on both ends, sometimes flat, and then hollowed out using tools and fire. Though the Caribs would usually paddle it, Europeans prefer to row. They would also mount a mast and a single square sail in the canoe. It really mustn't be underestimated how popular and effective the canoe was. Pirates could make their own, carry them across stretches of land, and use them in swarms to overpower larger vessels like sloops and barks. A number of buccaneers armed with muskets could pose a serious threat in these tiny vessels, as proven by the Battle of Panama in 1680, when a number of them defeated a small fleet of Spanish pirate hunters. Obviously, it was preferred to have a proper decked vessel, since it was more comfortable and could carry more cargo, but the canoe was an excellent starting point. Larger than the canoe was the piragua or periagua. These were two canoes cut in half and combined into one bigger vessel. Some piraguas might have been constructed from a single tree, or even by European methods using planks. They varied immensely in size, usually having a single mast, but often two, and they could accommodate between 15 to as many as 100 men. And tactically they were used much like the canoe, but could accomplish so much more. Most of the vessels in this video have utilized square sails, with a single lateen sail sometimes relegated to the mizzenmast. The lateen sail would continue to dominate in its Mediterranean cradle, and some of the ship types of the region would spread into the New World via the Spanish, like some of the previous types. Most visually notable is the tartane. It ranged in size from a small fishing boat to 300-ton merchantmen, and carried between 1 to 3 masts, all of them rigged with lateen sails. The foremost mast was raked forward, and with a long sharp spur, it looked both exotic and roguish, like something you'd find on the Barbary coast. The shape of the lateen sail allows them to sail against the wind more effectively, and the smaller sail area could easily be managed by a small crew. But this also meant that they were less useful downwind compared to a square sail. This lack of flexibility led to the development of hybrid rigs like the Polacker and Shebeck, but these were Mediterranean and not New World vessels. In the late 18th century, the tartane also evolved into a hybrid rig, but it doesn't seem to have been the case in the 17th century. Tartanes were used by pirates on a couple of occasions. Most prominently, William Dampier had the honor of sailing one, though he said that it didn't perform so well at chasing. This tartane, captured from the Spanish, had carried a crew of 30 and an armament of 4 swivel guns. It was later sold to a Jamaican merchant. So overall, there is probably a reason for why the tartane wasn't a common pirate vessel, but it was still good enough if you lacked better options. Essentially a bigger version of the piragua, the galley, also called half galley or galeota, was a Mediterranean design taken by the Spanish and rebuilt in the colonies. It is one of the few Caribbean vessels which we have an early and very precise blueprint of. It had a long hull with a raised aftercastle, upon which the commander would stand. The flag of Spain flooded from the stern. Between the castle and the sharp prow sat 30 oarsmen, each one a sword or musket-armed warrior, additionally bolstered by 4 or 6 swivel guns, and 1 or 2 carriage guns in the fore. Speed was further bolstered by a pair of lateen-rigged masts. The half-galley was fast, flexible, and incredibly dangerous. It was primarily used by the Guarda Costa, a Spanish paramilitary force deployed to hunt pirates and smugglers, but often behaving like them themselves. They would capture innocent merchants and leave few or no survivors to tell of their crimes. Some of the half-galleys were captured by French and English pirates, and used as auxiliary vessels in their fleets. One is depicted here in an eyewitness illustration from the 1680s. 2 filibusters are seen dabbing victoriously in front of it. Galley could also refer to galley ships. This was a wide range of sail ships built to better accommodate oars. They included galley frigates, long and slender men-of-war and privateers, with a lower oar deck and an upper gun deck, initially built to combat the Barbary corsairs. William Kidd's Adventure Galley was one such vessel. The smaller galley ships were also popular as scouts, pirate hunters, and even merchants. Most of the merchant galleys were built for specific purposes. Some needed the oars to better escape the French corsairs that haunted the English Channel during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Others were like the Mary Galley, constructed in 1704 by Thomas Bowery as an interloper, an unlicensed trader in the East India trade. He presumably needed the oars to escape from the company's wrath. As we can see, the oar ports were cut between the gun ports, rather than having their own oar deck. When not in use, the oars would have been lashed to the side of the aftercastle, whereas on bigger ships like the Adventure, they might have been stored amidships. Galley ships were flexible, speedy, and carried a decent armament. They were arguably the best pirate ships of the Golden Age, as they embodied everything the scalawags desired. That brings us to the end of the most popular ship types used by pirates of the Golden Age. Naturally, some vessels had to be left out, since they're poorly documented or weren't used by pirates enough to warrant a mention. As can also be seen, most of the types found themselves in a grey zone, where they embodied similar qualities and designs, but could be called by different names. A sloop could be a brigantine, but also a bark, a shallop, a corvette, a frigate, a yacht, or pinnace. One might go insane thinking too much about it, but it is more important to recognize the qualities which a pirate looked after in his ship. As perfect a balance as possible between speed, maneuverability, firepower, and carrying capacity. It had to be flexible, perform well under oars, resistant to storms, and easily pass over shallows and reefs. Not every vessel could fulfill this criteria, and some sacrifice had to be made when selecting a vessel. But for the most part, pirates made the best of what they could get.